Thanks a lot. And maybe we'll start with Kuba's lecture. Please, Kuba, if you could introduce yourself,
Sure.
who you are, and so on.
Yeah, just to begin with, like a quick disclaimer, because I'm currently at my parents' house, which is kind of in the country in Western Poland. So I have kind of difficult technological conditions. So if the connection breaks or you don't hear me or something, please notice me, right? So I skip back a little and repeat what you have missed. Also, the as you can see, the lighting conditions are pretty terrible here, so you'll probably not be able to see my face very often. But we'll jump to the presentation anyway, and you'll be watching slides. So my name is Kuba Depczyński. Just like Natalia already said, I am an art historian. I work for the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw as an educator, researcher, and a very beginner level curator, just starting my first own curating public programs of events. I do kind of a lot of research work. I do a lot of event organizing, and I do quite a lot of different lectures. I run reading groups, informal seminars, self self-education activities as well. But I'm here today not to represent the Museum of Modern Art, but rather to represent the anti-fascist year. And maybe jump to the first slide. I'll hope that you'll be able to see it. We tested it already, so it should be working. Can anyone confirm that you see the slides now?
Yes, I can see it. So
Perfect. So that's
yeah.
the logo of the anti-fascist year. Also, during the lecture, if you have questions or need clarifications, totally feel free to interrupt me and ask them. But we'll also have, I guess, like 10, 15 minutes after the lectures exactly for me to, take questions and discuss the topics and the cases that we'll be that we'll be discussing together, so you can reserve and keep your questions for the very end of the lecture, or just interrupt me and we will jump to the discussion immediately. So what you see now is the logo of the anti-fascist year. Unfortunately, the logo is available only in Polish. We don't have an English version of the logo, but we have an English version of our website. I would love to show you the website interactively and skip through the different sections now, but it would be pretty difficult with the online lecture. So I highly encourage you just to visit the website. It is fully available in English. We also have our Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube channels that you can also visit. And here is our email if you wish to contact the anti-fascist year for any reason. Please feel free to write to us. I'm just one of the members of a large group of different artists, activists, researchers, institutions, groups, NGOs, foundations, associations, social movements that form the anti-fascist year. And what the anti-fascist year is kind of a coalition, coalition that unites all those different entities, both individuals and groups. Big institutions like the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, for example, is also part of the anti-fascist year. Um, and the goal of this coalition is to promote a certain set of values. The main slogan behind the anti-fascist year is obviously the old school anti-Nazi, anti-fascist slogan from 1920s and 30s, which simply says against war, against fascism. That's the very core, the ideological core of the anti-fascist year coalition. And this coalition is working to promote certain set of values that oppose violence, oppose oppression, oppose resurgence of fascism, which is contemporarily disguised in all those weird ideologies and weird political and social movements, very often known as post-fascism, neo-fascism, new far right. There are all of the different names circulating in public debate. We kind of try to oppose all of them, reconnect them to their true predecessors, which are, the historical fascist movements and fascist political parties, which actually, as we'll probably see during the lecture, we claim that, fascism, even after the Second World War and the ultimate defeat of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, fascism as an ideology, political and social movement never really disappeared. It continued to morph, it continued to create all those different hybrid structures that were operating, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and obviously in the 21st century as well. So this coalition that Anti-Fascist Year is, how we do promote those values. How do we, oppose fascism, oppose war, oppose glorification of violence. We also try to commemorate the historical anti-fascist figures, important artists, activists, politicians. We kind of try to commemorate and bring public attention to their actions and to the way they were historically opposing fascism. And we are also trying to show that there is a long-lasting, distinct tradition of anti-fascist theory and anti-fascist practice, especially in the field of arts. Well, the Anti-Fascist Year tries to promote all of those ideas by organizing a countrywide program of events. Maybe you somehow encountered some events that are part of the public of the program of the Anti-Fascist Year. Basically, any individual, institution, organization, NGO, social movement, whatever it is, organizes cultural events and social activities that can be exhibitions, screenings, discussions, talks. Apparently, our workshop is also part of the Anti-Fascist Year program. You can find a workshop that you're currently taking part in on our website. Obviously, in the events section, you'll find all of those different activities and events that were organized under the Anti-Fascist Year, Anti-Fascist Year's name. So this is how it works. The program officially started on September 1st, 2019, to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the outbreak of the Second World War, and it was supposed to symbolically end on May 8th, 2020, which is the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe. But probably due to the global pandemic of COVID-19, we'll probably won't be able, to organize the celebratory events, for the official end of the Anti-Fascist Year. But we treat those dates rather symbolically, because we believe that, Anti-Fascist Year will be going on for as long as it is needed in contemporary Poland, and we kind of believe that it's still needed now, and it will be needed even after May 8th. So we are also obviously, planning to move all those activities that we planned for the official celebrations of the end of the Anti-Fascist Year. We plan to move them. Well, we don't know when to, right? But hopefully it will happen, or maybe we'll have to move all of the activities online. So this is what we do, and part of the Anti-Fascist Year, and part that I'm most responsible for, is the Atlas section. That you can see that our website has an Atlas section. This Atlas is like a historical archive of different anti-fascist and anti-war activities, mostly conducted by artists, but also activists. It's basically like a small historical book with chapters on different artists and different historical figures that, in their practice, very often artistic practice or design practice, or their political practice or social activism, opposed fascism and opposed war in the 20th and 21st centuries. And we treat this atlas, this archive, as a toolbox. We want to present it to contemporary public, contemporary artists, contemporary activists, as a set of ideas, practices, tactics, and tools that can be reappropriated, that you can copycat, that you can make use of again today in our contemporary situation. Obviously, kind of changing them so they fit appropriately to our contemporary needs. So this lecture that I'm giving you now is mostly based on the research that we did for the archive. The archive was done by Bogna Stefańska, Aleksy Wójtowicz, and me. We are 3 art historians. All of us graduated from the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw. We studied art history, and we basically, started this like grassroots endeavor, because the whole Anti-Fascist Year thing is kind of like a grassroots idea and a grassroots endeavor that's not financed by the government or by anyone. We basically do it all on our own, and we just make use of the resources that different people, different institutions, and different organizations and groups bring to the coalition. So today, in scope of today's workshop, I'll try to speak about different examples of historical anti-fascist and anti-war artistic activities that kind of can be a source of inspiration for you, and well, basically for all of us, right, in our contemporary situation, namely that can kind of inspire you on how we can act what we can do while we are experiencing this, current situation, which we can call the state of exception. That's one of the notions that appeared while I was discussing the lecture previously with Claudiusz and with Natalia. That probably you will go deeper into the idea of the state of exception as it is formulated by Carl Schmitt in his political philosophy, but also Giorgio Agamben. I'm pretty sure that you're going to read something from Giorgio Agamben, discuss his idea of what state of exception is and how it resonates with our contemporary, lockdown and isolation situation that we all have to deal with now. But we can think about many of those different anti-fascist, anti-war artistic activities and activities that actually, blur the boundary between art and activism, because many of those artists, and this is a kind of the thing that we actually achieved with this atlas, is to show that, politically engaged artists, it's not a thing of the, it's not anything new. That artists in 1920s and 1930s, when they were combating, the first real historical fascism, whether they were combating fascism in Spain or Italy, or whether it was obviously Nazi Germany, they came up with a number of tactics, a number of ideas of how to make use of art and artistic competences and visual graphic competences in the how to make use of them for political and activist reasons. And there's a long, tradition, very distinct, that you can pinpoint, that you can, describe even in, art history terms, if you're interested in that. So today I'll try to discuss a couple of examples of historical anti-fascist, anti-war activities that we can think about as, those states of exceptions, right? That we can think about as artistic activities that were undertaken to, protest against certain states of exception, to bring public attention to those, exceptions from our normality, because very often, those states of exception are not only things that happen every now and then when there is a war or catastrophe. You can think about states of exception as actually part of our, everyday so-called normality, right? That there is some kind of a normal order that we follow every day, but there are always exceptions to that, right? The famous example of Giorgio Agamben that he analyzed numerous times is that, our contemporary places where we find those states of exception from normal rule and normal law are obviously, for example, refugee camps. But we can also think about, in contemporary Poland, we can think about the situation of women, we can think about the situation of ethnic, religious, racial, sexual minorities, which are, they don't, very often the law doesn't follow the regular rules when it comes to the representatives of those on those minorities. And some contemporary sociological, political theoreticians or philosophers believe that actually, every normality is actually founded on certain exceptions, that every time that you create like a regular order of things, of how society and politics works, you also need to create certain exceptions. And obviously, the entity that's responsible for creating the exceptions, actually those who are in power, they're able to decide, which bodies, which people actually follow the normal order, and which of them will actually, have some specific exemplary rules to follow for them. So this is the main idea that we can keep in mind when we think about those different artistic activities, how those artists, pointed to those states of exception, how they dealt with them, how they wanted to actively protest them, how they want to ridicule them from time to time. And I also tried to focus less on art and more, first of all, on activism, and think more about, design, graphic design as political intervention. How can you actually use graphic design? How can you create graphics that are actually, that actually try to somehow deal with this situation of the state of exception, in very broad terms of what state of exception might mean. And in many cases, actually, those graphic designs were very immediate reactions to what was happening around us. Nowadays, in the situation of social isolation and basically a large-scale lockdown, those graphic interventions very often mean, working on Facebook, on Instagram, creating memes, etc. So we can kind of try to find, historical precedents for similar activities. I focus on the anti-fascist strain of that kind of activism, but surely you'll find, artists and graphic designers that work in a similar manner, in similar fashion, with maybe different political ideas. Although I firmly believe that, opposing any kind of violence, any kind of injustice is part of the anti-fascist ethos. So, in the Atlas of the Anti-Fascist Year, you also find examples of, post-colonial art or feminist art. Obviously, those topics very often, those things and those topics very often crisscross one another. They very often come together. And also, the important thing that we have to remember is that those artists who struggled in 1920s and 30s, who struggled in 1960s and 70s, for example, protesting the Vietnam War, which is, another kind of state of exceptional artists, protesting the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet in Chile in 1980s. All of them believed that, disseminating those graphic designs, polluting the public visual spheres with counter-narrative, with counter-images that kind of oppose or protest, the normal and usual order, is of utmost importance. That this is directly a political activity that is really, really important, that you have to democratize the visual public sphere, that you have to make it very, allow for difference when it comes to visual public sphere, that you have to, disseminate, and you have to publish all of those different images that kind of try to counter the official mainstream narrative or the mainstream visual culture. And this is a thing that you probably are pretty well aware of, right? I'm kind of convinced that in Poland, it's actually the far right groups that excel with that, because, for example, in the block of flats where I live, the entrance to the block of flats is sprayed with swastikas, and there are all those weird stickers stick to the door that, promote far-right values and, radical nationalist ideology. So I think that if you're interested in opposing that narrative, and this is what the Anti-Fascist Year tries to do, you have to do the same thing. You have to design clothes, you have to design stickers, posters, graffiti, street art, all of those things that make up our public visual sphere. So with those ideas in mind, let's jump to the examples. And the first example is one of my favorites, actually, John Hartfield, German Dada artist, most active in the 1920s and 30s. John Hartfield was not born John Hartfield. His actual name was Helmut Herzfelde. He took part in the First World War. He was fighting on the front, and then, he suffered from paranoia, and he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. So he was moved from the front to the war hospital, where he was treating other people with psychiatric diseases. I mean, he was working basically as a nurse in this hospital. And after those experiences, John Hartfield started to really, really harshly oppose nationalist ideology. He opposed patriotism. He obviously became a declared pacifist, and he also decided to change his name from Helmut Herzfelde to John Hartfield in order not to be connected with German nationalist ideology that he believed still pervaded in Germany in 1920s and 30s. Hartfield was a declared communist, although he was never a member of the Communist Party, especially after in early 1930s he visited Moscow and saw what kind of, what it means, like a Stalinist communism in Soviet Russia. He decided that he'll never ever join the Communist Party. Nevertheless, in his artistic practice, he was always exposing all those kinds of all the elements of the prevailing mainstream ideology that he believed is a authoritarian, even totalitarian, we might use these words from today's perspective, John Hartfield wouldn't use those ways, that make up this totalitarian ideology that's German nationalism. He was constantly criticizing, obviously, capitalism. He was criticizing Catholic religion, conservatism. He was criticizing, he was even criticizing the Communist Party, but, probably from another standpoint. And the means he used to criticize and expose all those all those elements of this prevailing ideology that he believed was actually, that he believed that this ideology is actually what, will end up ultimately with war. John Heartfield was very well aware that, for example, the Nazi Party was going to start war, another war another war was his biggest fear, right? Because he participated in the First World War and he really, really didn't want it to ever happen again, as we can see in this work, right, entitled Niemals wieder, which means obviously never again. But John Heartfield, to kind of to deliver his ideas and his narrative, he used montages and and collages. He was actually using the most contemporary graphic techniques that were super popular in 1920s and 30s in advertising. John Heartfield, well, he was basically following and mocking the mainstream visual culture of interwar Germany, first called Weimar Republic, then obviously the Third Reich. So he was using the same techniques as, early mass media advertising. He was creating those spectacular, stunning, surprising montages, juxtaposing different elements cut out from magazines, books, illustrations that he was, meticulously for hours gluing together, and then he was rephotographing them. So these are like photographs of, analog handmade collages, and thanks to rephotographing them, they appeared very flat. Today they appear as something that you could come up with in 5 minutes in Photoshop, right? But remember, it's 1930s. It wasn't as easy back then. So when we look at Heartfield's work, we have to remember that he was using the most contemporary, most state-of-the-art techniques that were really, something very new for the general public, something exciting, some part of the, like flourishing visual culture of 1920s and 30s Germany. But what's most important, the most stunning thing is that today we know Heartfield montages. Obviously, Heartfield was always referring to particular political figures, right? I hope that you laughed a little bit at this one, right? Because it's a well-known fact that Adolf Hitler was a vegetarian. John Heartfield was not afraid to criticize Hitler, to criticize NSDAP, to criticize Goebbels, Himmler, the most powerful Nazi politicians of the time, in person, directly. He would attack them directly. He was always, in his works, he was reacting to current political issues, to what was happening in the country. And obviously, you can see that his works were very fierce, very often brilliant, funny, very often very brilliant, very funny, although that we might say that sometimes he was kind of over the top, that sometimes we think that this is too much, that this is like, this is propaganda, not art. And well, John Heartfield once claimed that he simply is a propaganda artist who uses scissors to change politics, scissors and glue to change politics. Nevertheless, the most stunning thing about John Heartfield is that his works were never meant to be actually works of art. Nowadays, you can encounter them in exhibitions, in museums, exhibited as a very important part of art history, as, early examples of modern collage and modern photomontage. John Heartfield is very often called the father of modern artistic photo montages. But John Heartfield, all the works that I'm showing you here, like Never Again, or Don't Afraid He's a Vegetarian, or whoever reads bourgeois newspapers becomes blind and deaf. Obviously, John Heartfield was also very critical of bourgeois culture and bourgeois ideology of the interwar Germany. Were actually covers of a magazine. These are graphic designs for covers of Arbeiter Illustrierte Zeitung, the most popular workers' magazine that was published in Germany in 1920s, 1930s. At its peak of its popularity, there were over 1 million copies of this magazine sold every week. And now imagine this situation, imagine 1930s Germany, nationalism, conservatism, militarism everywhere, NSDAP rising to power, the Nazi ideology prevailing in the public sphere, and in every kiosk, on every corner of every street in Berlin, every couple of days there come up the AIZ newspaper with the new cover by John Heartfield, which, openly attacks Hitler, openly attacks the Nazi ideology, openly opposes capitalism, openly opposes war, openly opposes patriotism and nationalism. Obviously, John Heartfield suffered for that, and he, there were consequences for him when Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933. He was he became the number 5 person on the list of the opponents of state, the list created by Gestapo, and only a month later, actually, it happened actually around Easter, that an execution squad assaulted John Hartfield's studio. He managed to escape. He had to jump out of the balcony of his studio on the first floor, and he hid for 8 hours under a trash can. And then on foot, without any of his belongings, without any of his works, on foot, he escaped to Czechoslovakia because he was simply, deemed an enemy of Nazi state, and he was supposed to be executed. He first escaped to Czechoslovakia, where he continued to publish his political montages and political works. Then he escaped to the United Kingdom, and he came back to Germany in 1948 after the Second World War. And what's stunning, at the very end of his career, he returned to Germany in 1948. He believed that, he could continue his artistic work in post-war Germany. And he was shocked to find out that, he returned to Eastern Germany, to the communist part of Germany. And he was shocked to find out that many of the former members of the Nazi party were actually people who were actually, now members of the Communist Party of Eastern Germany, and that they were in power, they were still in power. So obviously John Hartfield, immediately after returning to Germany in 1940s, he started to publish more caricatures, more collages, more montages, this time attacking the Communist Party of Germany, which shows us that, he was not kind of an ideology blinded person. He was simply critical of the reality, and he thought that this is yet another weird state of exception, right? That, totalitarian politicians from the NSDAP party after the Second World War, they remained in power, just changed their name to Communist Party. And this is why John Hartfield was actually kind of banned from public art world in Germany until 1956. It's only after 1956 that he was allowed to exhibit his work again. So this is like my favorite historical example, a guy who was really with such a strong ideas and with such strong ethics that he really believed his cause. And for him, creating art in 1930s Germany, when there was Gestapo was after him, the socialist and communist parties were banned and delegalized, yet he still managed to create those works, create those magazine covers, and publish them to open public. He was absolutely not interested in exhibiting his works in museums or galleries or making art career. He actually believed that he was using his artistic competences to exactly do what he believed was so important, right? To create visual counter narratives, to disseminate them in public, to wage wars with images on the streets, for example, on the streets of Berlin, but other German cities as well. And the next example that I wanted to talk about, these are, as you can see, again, collages, much later collages, a super famous, super important series of collages by Martha Rosler, the great American feminist artist. Martha Rosler is a professional artist, one of the most important early feminist and early video artists from the United States. But I want to discuss her series of collages that she created between 1967 and 1972, entitled House Beautiful, Bringing the War Home. And in those images, Martha Rosler juxtaposes photographs cut out from House Beautiful magazine, hence the title of the series, but not only, but also magazines such as Architectural Digest, namely magazines that were presenting, the very idealized visions of how perfect suburban American middle-class homes should look like, right? How a perfect middle-class apartments and homes should look like. These magazines were kind of like, like IKEA catalogs. They were advertising certain furniture, certain design, at the same time, selling those items and selling this furniture and selling those things, creating kind of, they were responsible for how millions of houses of Americans in 1950s, 60s, and 70s looked like. And Martha Rosler cuts out those images and juxtaposes them with media representations of the Vietnam War. We have to bear in mind that Vietnam War was one of the first wars, or maybe even the very first war in the world history, that was actually broadcasted in media 24/7. It was covered non-stop in television, in radio, in the press. They didn't have internet back then, but the war was very well covered in the media. Those images of the war were present everywhere in 1960s and 70s in the United States. Yet again, we can think about this war, as an state of exception, and also the situation of this society which encounters the images of war all the time, yet tries to live normally and not think about uh, about husbands and cousins and sons and brothers who were taken to the front, allegedly to fight for democracy. Although many of the artists who were engaged in anti-war protests in the 1960s and 70s in the States actually believed that there was no real reason, that this was an unjustifiable war, right? That this was only about geopolitics and American interests. The Vietnam War, the anti-war activists often called the Vietnam War the so-called living room war, the war that we encounter when we open the TV, when we enter our house, and confront the media. We're confronted with those images of suffering, of death. And obviously, Martha Rosler made use of that, right? She juxtaposed the idealized images of perfect middle-class suburban houses with representations of death, suffering, and unjustifiable war. She believed that it was unjustifiable. This is probably the most famous image from Martha Rosler's series entitled "The Ambush." So obviously, how we can understand those images? Well, there are so many interesting, fascinating, interpretations and critiques and essays and books written about those colleges. Obviously, Martha Rosler is, juxtaposing war and prosperity, life and death. She's juxtaposing two very extreme, she's juxtaposing extremely different notions, and sometimes those colleges are treated as critique of the American middle class and those ideas of peaceful, prosperous life, because Rosler, she kind of exposes the fact that the peaceful American families living their middle class, prosperous lives are actually buying all those items and buying all those furniture and design and products. At the same time, they are funding the war that's waged somewhere else, somewhere in the other corner of the planet, and not really care about where their money goes. But the reality is that, in part at least, their prosperous life was funded by war endeavors, and at the same time, the war endeavor was funded from their consumption and from their capitalist consumptionist lifestyle. On the other hand, there's also, obviously, Martha also is juxtaposing, the comfort, peaceful life of the American middle class with the suffering, both of Vietnamese and both, the American soldiers in the fronts. This is also very often, as Martha Rosler is one of the most important feminist artists in the history of history of Western art in the 20th century. It is also those colleges are often considered feminist works of art, that they show how war actually begins at home, that patriarchal family relationships are the starting point, the starting point for a long chain of events that ends up, with invasion, with war, with men shooting one another. Obviously, those images also show how war and violence are prevalent in the feminine sphere, because in 1960s and 70s, household sphere was still considered something very feminine and very womanly. So it was kind of an unusual thing to see, war, oppression, suffering, death being part of the household sphere. And kind of Martha Rosler, exposes the fact that women suffer from all those things, from all this patriarchal violence that's behind the war, is also behind the family relationship and the relationship with husbands and wives, etc., fathers and daughters. Which is also, another state of exception, right? We can clearly see that even today in contemporary Poland, women are treated differently than men. There are certain exceptions and differences when it comes to both to, customs and everyday practice and to law regulations. And there is, and the most, yet again, there is a fascinating fact about those colleges, which was actually, it is part of the story that's rarely told, that those works from 1960s, late 60s, early 70s, those colleges were also never meant to be works of art. Although they are part of the collection of Museum of Modern Art in New York now, they were actually leaflets that Martha Rosler was zero copying and bringing to anti-war demonstrations. She treated them, she turned them into posters and were simply, gluing them to the walls of buildings in the city in New York. These were protesting images. These were, they were photocopied, and there were reproductions of those colleges, and, student signs or leaflets or pamphlets with anti-war manifestos. Martha Rosler never actually thought about these works as works of art. It was only in 1980s that the curators from MoMA approached Martha Rosler and told her that they would like to buy those images to their collection. But so this is when actually Martha Rosler, invented the titles for each of the work, and also invented the dates on, in which year which college was created. And this is also gives us an insight into how, a work of art is created, actually, that the images existed for over a decade, yet for them to become a part of art collection, they had to have titles and dates, and obviously they had to be signed as Martha Rosler's works. And there comes the most interesting thing: why actually Martha Rosler decided to juxtapose the male sphere of war, oppression, domination, and fight and suffering with the, peaceful, womanly household sphere. I'm speaking about, obviously, I'm very much generalizing that, but this is how, this is based on, reception of the works, where maybe the Rosler's idea was that, if anyone can actually stop the war, it's the women, it's not the men. The men are already on the front shooting each other, right? It's the women who stayed at home, who had to keep, their everyday lives and keep actually, the economy going on, that it's, well, what happened? Oh, I'm back. That Martha Rosler with her colleges was actually trying to appeal to women. And this makes perfect sense, because if you take a look at photographs from 1960s and 70s that show the Vietnam anti-war demonstration, where, Martha Rosler was coming with her leaflets and giving them out to protesters, most of those protesters were obviously women. Mostly women were protesting against the Vietnam War. That's maybe why Martha Rosler thought about, was thinking about creating images that were actually, appealing to women and to, to the images and to the sphere that they know best. Martha Rosler also recreated the series in 2004, 2008. She created the second series of the House Beautiful, Bringing the War Home colleges. This time, it's not the Vietnam War anymore. This time, it's Afghanistan, it's Iraq, it's the global war on terror, it's the new wars, new conflicts. You can clearly see that the soldiers are different. The images are different. Some of them even became super viral, very well known memes. These images, well, the old ones were obviously done with scissors and glue, just like John Hartfield. These are analog colleges, and these ones are obviously done in some some graphic design software. I don't know whether it was Photoshop, GIMP, Paint, whatever. And some of them actually, become internet memes and started the life of their own, like, for example, this image. And you can clearly see that also the enemy changed, right? The one who were, attacked, the subject that was attacked in old colleges was clearly the American middle class with its, prosperous consumerist life. But in 2006, 2007, 2008, the bad guys are now, your stock image of a Wall Street banker. Those young wolves of Wall Street are now the main enemy, according to Martha Rosler, because they are those who fund wars, and they are those who make profit on wars. So, next thing to stay in the feminist context, I want to show you a couple of posters, but by great group of artists. It's even, I don't know, well, excuse me, just needed a sip of water. The Sea Red Women's Workshop, which was a group of artists. Apparently, altogether, there were like 45 to 50 different artists working as part of Red Women's Workshop. Most of them never actually revealed their names. Some of them might be very well known and recognizable artists. Some may be completely underground, not well known not well known, not well known individuals. In 1974, in London, they established this great workshop that worked for the next 15 years. They worked collectively on feminist posters. Their poster design and the way they worked is an important and huge part. A huge part of feminist struggles in 1970s and 1980s. Great Britain, they didn't only operate in London, they moved, their workshop was moving around. They were very often visiting also small cities. They were also visiting villages when they tried to work together with local women to work on their issues, to put, to create posters that were based on individual perspective and individual experiences of different women. And obviously, their main task, as their manifesto said, was to combat the unfair stereotypes about women and the, unjustified ways in which women were portrayed in mainstream visual culture. Yet again, the C-Red Women's Workshop believed that, creating, disseminating, popularizing different counter images, images of women that would counter the mainstream narrative, that would counter the stereotypes about women, was a super important part of their political work and their political activism. And 1970s, 1980s Britain was not that was not an easy task to do. Obviously, in big cities there were feminist movements, but the C-Red Women's Workshop was well known for also working with, well, small town or even countryside publics, that they would come to the countryside, to a small English town in the north part of Great Britain, and then, for example, try to work with wives of, I don't know, local miners or local workers, for them to express themselves, with posters, to express themselves with graphic design. Some of them, you can see that they are clearly very beautiful. Most of those are undated, and most of the posters also don't have titles, and they also don't have authors, because the C-Red Women's Workshop completely rejected the idea of authorship. They were never ever signing their posters. Till this day, we don't know about many members of the workshops who prefer to stay anonymous, simply sign themselves with sign their works with the name of the groups. Obviously, those works are also never ever supposed to be works of art. It's only, in 1990s that some art institutions started to buy those works and to make them part of their collection. C-Red Women's Workshop was also, doing graphic designs for other organizations, for local women organizations, for different kinds of associations, for church as well sometimes, but they would never ever obviously produce works that would somehow counter their ideas or their beliefs. They always worked on different posters collectively. They, like I said, they never worked individually, and they would never ever sign their own works with their names. They were also running self-education groups. They were obviously trying to they also tried different means to popularize feminist thought and feminist social and political critique. They were producing, not only posters, but also calendars, postcards, notebooks with their designs, with their slogan, with their images, that were later, simply sold or simply, given away during feminist events or protests, or, disseminating among fellow female comrades and, other people interested in feminist stuff and organizing feminist social activities. And also because of their, the way they work, they were actually for a very long time rejected from the official artwork. Although although their designs are great, even today you can clearly see there's a great catalog of their works that collects many of their, beautifully designed posters and beautifully designed, other items also beautifully designed. In their work, obviously good designs always comes together with, strong political message. So you can clearly see now, probably even from those three examples, that there is like a tradition, there is a there's some ancestry to all those different kind of political activities. And if you think about people nowadays, for example, creating images and, publishing them on Instagram, circulating them in social media, republishing, creating memes, you can clearly see that these are contemporary descendants of people like Hartfield, Rosler, or See Red Women's Workshop, right? These are kind of practices that's been ongoing for over 100 years, very often connected to political and social activism, that try to make use of, artistic competences and art and graphic design, for example, to combat, to protest, or even to bring public attention to some oppression, or, to state of exception. There's another one, for example, lesbians are coming out in full force. I love the cat saying, lesbians are everywhere, the cat thinks. The cat being, like one of the beings that very often lives in See Red Women's Workshop posters, being, the wise cat, definitely a symbol that they've been using very, very often. And yet another example that I really, really, really like, and which is really, really amazing, is the really amazing example of what can you do with art, even if you're not an artist, is the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp, a protest. From what I know, the Greenham Common Peace Camp is known as the longest lasting, one protest that lasted for the longest ever in human history, because the protest was going on constantly since 1981 until 2000. Greenham Common is a name of a military base that's located in the southern part of England. And in 1981, the British government decided that this will be the place where, together as part of NATO operations, they decided to store missiles with nuclear warheads in Greenham Common, which obviously, it was Cold War. We have to remember 1980s Cold War, nuclear paranoia. People were still very much afraid of the atomic bomb and nuclear warfare, and even probable end of the world, right, when it comes if it all ends up being a war between different countries that actually possess nuclear weapons, that they could simply bomb each other and in this way destroy the whole world. So as early as in 1981, a couple of weeks after the decision was officially publicly announced by the British government, a group of women known as Women for Life on Earth came to Greenham and started to occupied it. They simply laid a siege around the military base, and since 1981 until 2000, they were constantly present there. Obviously, they were not let into the base. They couldn't. They couldn't enter the base, so they were simply protesting around the location. They simply were protesting around the fence that is 30 kilometers long. That the fence that's circulating that around the base. This is one of their collective protests. During those protests, those women, there were obviously artists among them, but most of them were simply social activists. And from what I know, 80–90% of them were just, simple women, nothing, there's nothing very special about them. These were not graphic designers, these were not artists, yet they created one of the most stunning art exhibitions ever, because they turned this 13-kilometer long fence around the base into great one gigantic display of anti-war and anti-fascist art, because they actually believed that, they were not only protesting against nuclear warheads, they were not only protesting against the atomic bomb, but they were, for example, as many artists did, this is what also Martha Rosler did, for example, that, some practices, some parts of, politics of the British government, for example, 1980s, kind of resemble fascist politics, or at least, threatens similar consequences. And this is the same thing, for example, with Richard Nixon, that was, deemed fascist by artists protesting the Vietnam War, 1960s, 1970s. So this, struggle and protest against fascism is also an important part of very many anti-war artistic struggles. So coming back to Greenham Common, women there simply turned the whole fence around the military base into great beautiful, gigantic display of anti-war art in the form of, you can see balloons, photographs, collages, texts, paintings, kilts, banners, all kind of accessories that were hanging, everything, simply everything on this fence on the Anti-Fascist Year website. You can find many more images which show us, what kind of a beautiful beautiful art exhibition the Greenham Common Peace Camp was. During the time of the protest, those 19 years, at the peak of the popularity and during the biggest weekends for weekend protests around the base, there were over 50,000 people attending those protests. This is huge, and remember, this is not a big city. This is a remote location. This is a military base that's very far from any bigger cities. And sometimes there were only dozens of women protesting still, and this was exclusively women protest. This was exclusively women's camp. They were kind of incorporating the strategy that Martha Rosler believed in, that this is actually, if you want to stop war, you have to appeal to women. If anyone can stop the war, it's actually women. They were also creating like performances. For example, many of them were simply laying down on the ground in front of the entrance to the base, making it impossible for transports to arrive. They were also creating they were using more peaceful forms of protest. For example, for Christmas, they were preparing cakes and tea for the soldiers that were protecting the base. They were also obviously appealing to politicians, organizing, press conferences. But they also, during the course of the almost 20 years long protest, they also created many interesting relationships with those soldiers. Some of the soldiers are said to be actually seduced by the women's peace camp. And for example, we know that some of the soldiers actually, then, not openly but quietly supported the protest around the base. They were also organizing performances such as this one, in which they were simply, dressed up as animals, as very nice fluffy birds, and simply broke into the base and started dancing around the magazine with the warehouses with nuclear warheads. Obviously there was the press was present, and there were many photographs, and also there's a video documentation of some of the performances. And this is one of the most stunning examples of creative use of art in order to protest something that is state of exception, right? The military base with military warheads is clearly a state of exception when it is located, in the middle of a supposedly democratic, liberal, progressive country in Western Europe. And obviously, those women were very often appealing to the idea that those warheads, those nuclear weapons, are actually weapons of mass destruction that might destroy whole humanity, that this is very bad for their husbands, for their children, obviously, that, this base is kind of a sign that says to us there is no future, right? This is, the world is going to end sooner or later. We're going to bomb each other with nuclear missiles, and the world is going to end. So actually their struggle was for not only for peace, but also for future. Here we have also an image of their great songbook with very beautiful songs. You can find those protest songs on YouTube. They created this very, very nice songbook that you can also download online. There are many different stories, films, and photographs depicting the Greenham Common peace camp, and it's all of the activities that happened during the course of those 20 years. For us, the most interesting part is probably the graphic design and the idea to turn the fence, the thing that's the ultimate symbol of a border, of an exception, to turn it into something joyful, colorful, and beautiful, very witty, intelligent, not so hard, but rather kind of simply, catching the eye of the public and catching the eye of the viewer means that, you can easily, you can read wider audiences with your ideas and your beliefs. So, there we have also the Kada collective, another example I wanted to briefly talk about, because, and this will bring us closer to the conclusion of the lecture. Colectivo de Acciones de Arte, which means simply, collective for art actions, was founded in 1979 in Chile under the Augusto Pinochet authoritarian military far-right proto kind of fascism resembling regime. Probably you know the story, but just to quickly recap, in 1973, Augusto Pinochet was installed as a military dictator of Chile after a military coup that was co-organized by the United States of America, and in the coup overthrown and led to the death of the democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende. And under the military dictatorship of Chile was one of the harshest and most one of those military dictatorships that really came close to fascist government or fascist regime. Pinochet was really ruthless, in eliminating political opposition. The country quickly also turned out, the country quickly also turned out to be economically ineffective. So there was huge inequalities, huge poverty, a lot of social problems, and a lot of social tensions. Yet, the military dictatorship was simply using power and using army to keep the society in check and to keep them obedient. And life under Pinochet was like a life in a constant state of exception. And members of Kada, writers and conceptual artists, believe that in all their manifesto clearly says that if you want to politically change the country, if you want to overthrow the dictatorship, if you want to overthrow Pinochet and change Chile, you have to start with aesthetics. You have to change the visual culture of the country. You have to kind of subvert the visual domination of the regime, which is based on military, on false nationalism, fascism. And their idea was to create those actions in public, to create symbols, to disseminate those symbols, to diversify the public visual sphere, to introduce counter narratives, political, social, and also aesthetic counter narrative into public visual culture of Chile. And this is the most well-known action, known as No Plus. This is also important that the abbreviation of the name of the collective Kada means everyone in Spanish, and No Plus in Spanish simply means no more. This is kind of like an universal symbol of protest. Here we have an image of the first action that they did in 1983. They did it a couple of days before the official 10th anniversary of the Pinochet's rule. The whole country was preparing for great celebrations of the 10 years of the dictatorship. And then Kada comes with this action which says simply no more, right? No more dictatorship, no more inequality, no more violence, no more oppression. Obviously, back then in Chile in 1983, for hanging such a banner, you could simply go to jail, be killed, or, disappear forever. So Kada were risking a lot. They were risking as much as Hartfield in 1930s doing their works. And they again didn't think about this as art, rather as public political action. Nowadays, those images are obviously part of collections of many museums of art. So members of Kada really wanted to use art to change public sphere and, the public visual sphere and public aesthetics and subvert mainstream aesthetics in order for political change. And they quickly recognized that the No Plus symbol is very convincing, that it speaks to the people. So they asked many comrades and other artists and activists to make use of the No Plus symbol. They simply gave away the symbol they invented, the No Plus. And then it was in a matter of next couple of months, it was everywhere. Even today in Chile, if you go to Santiago or any other big city, there are hundreds of examples of street art, graffitis, with the No Plus sign, banners. The No Plus is everywhere in Chile. It's the most famous symbol of the political opposition against Pinochet. And here I just, browsed through the Google, just type in Google graphics No Plus symbol. This is a protester holding a No Plus sign during a students, not a previous protest, but during a students' protest 2018. You can Google the most recent anti-government protest in Chile. You'll find the No Plus sign everywhere. And the most interesting thing is that after the fall of Augusto Pinochet, the Kada group, the Colectivo de Acciones de Arte, simply dissolved. They stopped their activities because they believed they succeeded. They created the ultimate political symbol that changed the society and politics of 1980s Chile, and they simply stopped their stopped the activities of the group because they thought that they achieved their goal and the mission was complete. Although the No Plus sign lives life on its own till very today. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is the piece of the most stunning, one of the best examples of graphic design ever when it comes to the anti-fascist art, and this will lead us to the conclusion of the lecture, is the famous 3-hour arrow symbol created in 1931 by Sergei Chakotkin as a symbol created for the organization, in 1931 in Germany, for an organization known as the Iron Front. The Iron Front was a clear leftist, progressive, anti-Nazi organization that was linked to the Social Democratic Party of Germany. Sergei Chakotkin, the author of this symbol, which is probably, you know that pretty well, right? That 3 arrows are till very today one of the most important symbols of the global anti-fascist movement, of the global Antifa movement, or Antifascistische Aktion, so anti-fascist action movement. Chakotkin was a biologist and a socialist from Russia. He studied in the Institute for Experimental Biology, led by Ivan Pavlov. Probably you know the figure of the famous biology, Ivan Pavlov. And Chakotkin was one of his students. But he studied biology, but he was most interested in sociology and psychology of the masses, and how visual propaganda actually affects the mass society of 1930s. Chakotkin left Russia in 1919 and moved to Germany. Obviously, it was not easy for him as a socialist to stay in Russia after the Communist Revolution. He moved to Germany and he started studying actually the Nazi propaganda. He wrote a book on Nazi propaganda and how effective it is, and how the NSDAP party is creating a whole new aesthetics and visual culture that is very persuasive and very influential on people. And, Chakotkin was one of the first people in the world that was actually, saying that NSDAP may take over power, that Nazism might become a prevalent ideology in Germany. And he knew it only from studying their aesthetics and the images, that the Nazi party was creating and disseminating public sphere. He was warning the world, and, obviously no one listened to him for very long. And in 1933, he, together with Carlo Middendorf, a young socialist activist, they created this symbol. They were thinking about how to create a symbol that would oppose the Nazi swastika. And in 1931, they came up with this idea of those 3 arrows. The story says that Chakotkin actually saw this symbol drawn on a wall in the German city of Heidelberg, where someone on the wall simply crossed the swastika with 3 straight lines. And this is how Chakotkin came to the idea that, those 3 arrows are a great counter symbol that opposes the swastika, the symbol of Nazism. And his idea is that this is a very dynamic logo. Those 3 arrows are really kind of implying movement, force. And he believed that 3 arrows would always be a stronger symbol than a swastika, because it doesn't matter whether you cross the swastika with the arrows or whether you draw the swastika on the arrows, it will always look as if those arrows are piercing through the swastika, that they are, the ultimate symbol of defeating the other ideology, whatever the other ideology was. Here we can see the cover of the book that Chakotkin wrote on possible visual counter anti-Nazi visual propaganda called the 3 arrows against the swastika. And, those arrows quickly became the ultimate symbol of opposition against the Nazi party, against fascism everywhere in the world. As was with the idea, the original idea of Chakotkin and Carlo Middendorf was that those 3 different arrows symbolize the opposition against against reaction, capitalism, and fascism. These were those 3 arrows were fighting against and piercing through capitalism, reaction, and fascism. Obviously, the official meaning of those 3 hours has been changing many, many times. This is, for example, an example of the poster of the Iron Front, the organization for which Chakotkin and Middendorf came with the logo. And you can also clearly see the funny Hitler-faced swastika. But for example, when it was appropriated by the Social Democratic Party of Germany during the election, this is actually an election poster for the Social Democratic Party of Germany in 1932. They believed that those three arrows were actually representing opposition towards the Communist Party, the Nazi Party, and the Conservative Party, right? So they were against basically conservatism, against Nazism, and against state communism. Nowadays, according to, according to contemporary interpretation of the global anti-fascist movement, the three arrows symbolize the opposition against, let me find my notes, I want to confuse it. Maybe I'll find it in a second. Anyway, the three arrows were appropriated by many other political parties, social movements, activists all over the world. You can clearly see those different examples. This is the French Socialist Party, the Socialist International Movement, the Austrian Socialist Party. The PSD one is actually the contemporary logo of the Portuguese Social Democratic Party that still uses three arrows as its symbol, although the arrows were kind of, reappropriated to go upwards and now symbolizing rather, economic and social growth rather than, opposition to capitalism, fascism, and nationalism. I believe, according to contemporary interpretation, nowadays Antifa believes that those three arrows symbolize the opposition against fascism, nationalism, and war, right? So this is yet another good example of a symbol that is used by the anti-fascist year, the initiative, the coalition that I'm co-creating with a number of other talented, great people. But you can see that this is almost a timeless design, right? Since 1938, 31 till very today, this symbol of three arrows, symbol was, disseminated, popularized, democratized, reappropriated many times by different organizations and different people for their uses. Although, they still symbolize, the basic opposition against war, fascism, and nationalism till very today. And I wanted to conclude the lecture with an example of how we can actually use those historical references. We did this whole research on the three arrows story. You can read the, more elaborate and version of the history of three arrows on the Anti-Fascist Year's website. We did this whole research for an action that I co-organized and the Anti-Fascist Year co-organized for the last year's anti-fascist march, and that was happening in Warsaw on the National Independence Day as a march that opposed obviously the official march to celebrate the National Independence Day on November 11th. So we asked contemporary graphic designers to create their own contemporary interpretations of the three arrows. So you can see the designs here. There were like 6 or 7 different people. Each of them came up with 1 or 2 different designs. This is the first part of the designs that were done for the Anti-Fascist Year, although the action itself was not organized by the Anti-Fascist Year, rather, but a number of, contemporary artists that are kind of, that kind of support the views of the Anti-Fascist Year and work together with the Anti-Fascist Year. This is the second part of it, with the great, fake news, the three warriors on horses as three arrows, the LGBTQ version, obviously. So we created the graphic designers created those reinterpretations of the classic three arrows logo. At the same time, to commemorate the historical anti-fascists, to kind of, reappropriate this sign and bring back, public attention to this sign, because in Poland, obviously, Antifa and anti-fascism is basically usually associated with far left and, violent people in balaclavas fighting with, violent fascists on the streets, basically as, the same extreme as far right. On far right, you have fascists, on far left, you have anti-fascists. And we wanted to show that this is a different, more interesting tradition, and it's never that simple. And we printed those designs on large-scale banners, flags. We worked with a we worked with Bożena Wydrowska, who is a choreographer. She created a specific choreography for the banners, and a number of representatives of Polish art world, marched during the anti-fascist march on November 11th, 2019, with those flags designed, with 3 arrows designed by contemporary Polish graphic designers to kind of, bring back memory and also reappropriate the historical tools that had such a big significance, and this is also a piece of great design that you can, refer to, and you can reuse it again today. And that's the conclusion of the lecture. That's it, I wanted to conclude with one contemporary example to show you how, this historical research is actually useful for contemporary struggle, contemporary works, and, things that we can collectively do. Although in the situation of global pandemic, we probably couldn't use, organize a collective demonstration or a march. We can still use those designs. They're, available to anyone, free to download, to disseminate them, to use them, to publish them, to share them, on social media, anywhere. So there are probably many more better uses of those designs that we didn't come up with yet. So I think that would be it. And now I'll be happy to take your questions, to, answer questions, comment, objections, anything that pops into your mind.
Yes, maybe I would say that thank you very much, Kuba, for your lecture. It was really interesting to see all those cases, and you've mentioned a lot of issues I think worth discussing. And also I have a few remarks, but maybe I will leave them for later. I'm not sure if some of you guys attenders have a question for Kuba or a note, remarks you would like to share.
Don't be shy.
Yes.
It's always difficult with those online discussions.
Yeah, I know. So maybe I will just say that for me, I mean, you gathered like a lot of very interesting material, which could serve as an inspiration for our workshop.
Yes.
Personally, I love the Marta Rosler photo collages when she mixes middle class artifacts with the war symbols, and I think this is something which we want to the direction, one of the directions in which we want to push you all guys, as we will talk about it further, to play with this interpretation of modern times, like connecting political and private. And yeah, do you guys have any questions to Kuba about the lecture, maybe, or a few remarks?
And if you don't want to speak, maybe you can just type it in the chat, in the meeting chat.
Yes.
So maybe they are sleeping. Are you sleeping, all of you?
No, probably they're overwhelmed.
Yes.
I know. I know that this is how those lectures work, because I'm too much in love with the material, and I show too much and speak too much, and then it's always kind of overwhelming for the audience. So I'm kind of used to that,
Mm-hmm.
I have maybe a couple of comments, Kuba, because it was very, very interesting. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. There was some lag or something. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much, because it kind of it made me rethink or recontextualize, particularly with your examples by John Hertzfeld, how similar this style that he adopted, this simple style of an image and a simple slogan, is pretty much the MEMS tool that is used so much. Yes, not only by activists but generally by people on social media, etc. So it seems like this element of activism is connected to a very quick and simple message. Yes, something that is very accessible, that comes through. whatever the audience or whatever the technology that changes. The other thing that I was really interested in is this last project that you spoke about with the creation of the flags. Particularly that, you know, this symbol of the flag has somehow been overtaken by fascist kind of movements. Yes, we talk about that the flags themselves. So it was nice that you guys used this or reclaimed this idea of the flag to pose a different alternative. Yes. So maybe what I wanted to ask you is that not only because we are in this state of isolation, but generally it seems like this social media has become the platform for both radical movements and opposition movements as well. Yes. So could you tell us a little bit about maybe about that sphere? There's this kind of the virtual sphere, how that's being used, and do you think it's being? Do you think that any anti-fascist movements are able to use the online sphere as successfully as the fascist movement tends to use? Yes, it seems like when we talk about false media, false messages, etc. So could you tell us maybe a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. Like, obviously, there are, you know, great examples of using social media. You know, for example, recently, I'm sure you're all very familiar with the case of the abortion bill that was discussed recently in Polish Parliament, right? And you know, the feminist movement, the feminist groups in Poland organized a number of great online activities, you know, trying to protest and oppose this bill, right? For example, you know, they simply almost hacked the president's Instagram account, right? Flooding his account with feminist pro-abortion content or anti-abortion content, right? There was an artistic activity by Diana Lelonek, contemporary Polish artist. She was simply collecting recordings of people, you know, expressing their protest, verbally recording themselves, you know, protesting against this bill. And then she mixed all the recordings together, so they sounded as if they were recording on a demonstration. You know, it was like a fake demonstration done with simply voice recording. These are like, you know, super brief. You know, obviously the stories are more elaborate. It's more complex and more interesting. But these are, for example, good examples to follow. Also, there are, you know, maybe in contemporary Poland, I believe that social media, especially Twitter and Facebook, on Instagram it's more diverse, I think, are overtaken by far-right narrative, and it's very difficult to come with ideas that oppose, you know, those spread by far-right movements. Nevertheless, it's necessary. I personally think that this is very difficult, and you have to be very much aware of how feedback loops work within the, you know, social media milieu, that this is quite a different thing than simply, you know, reappropriating the tool of the flag and recreating or referring to a classic anti-fascist symbol, you know, and obviously kind of reappropriating the aesthetics of the official Independence Day march, right, with all their banners and large-scale Polish flags. It might be more difficult to use, you know, hashtags or images disseminated on Instagram creatively, but those two examples I think are good ones. And also I think that there are some very good examples, you know, in other countries. In Poland, for example, let's say progressive movements are not as good, you know, with social media, I believe, although some of them, you know, creating memes that ridicule the far right. Also, sometimes I've seen a couple of speeches by members of parliament who are from the Lewica party, from the left party. They were also kind of went viral. For example, the, you know, counter expose by Adrian Zandberg, or recently the speech by, I can't remember the name of the guy who was also, you know, mocking the far right for their kind of criticizing the ideology. You know, simply 4 minutes video that was really a powerful leftist progressive statement. And it also went viral and even, you know, reached my mom, who is not specifically politically engaged on any side nowadays. So I think there's also a lot to be done, and this is exactly, the ideas that Colectivo Acciones de Arte had, that, there's a lot to be done when it comes to visual public sphere. They were working within, urban milieu, because that was the milieu in which, the image war were waged on the streets. Nowadays, the wars with the use of visual content and images are waged on social media, especially in times of pandemics. So this is what has to be done, although it is difficult. There are good examples, and especially I think in Poland, feminist movement, is the point, the starting point where you can seek for inspirations.
Right.
Well, I would just add, I had a look at the president's Instagram, which is not my common destination, I would say, when the anti-abortion thing was going on. And I have to say that even seeing the amount of comments which are simply hashtag women's hell, it had that, for me, like really big impact. I think it's very important to even do this and to see that these are not bots or like fake accounts, but these are real people from different places in Poland. You can have a look at, they post all kind of different stuffs, and they all are united against let's say the president's will to sign this this law. For me, it was very shocking to see this. I never, I think, saw such a big action in the media.
Yeah, it's also very important for younger audiences, right? I remember the case of the TV station TVN, which kind of mocked or ridiculed a Korean K-pop singer who was elected the most sexy man of Earth 2019 or something like that, some kind of this, that kind of award. And then publicly on the commercial TV station TVN, the experts were kind of, laughing for him because they claimed that, all of the Koreans looks the same, which is obviously a ridiculous statement. And they were completely obliterated on Twitter by 15-year-old K-pop fans who simply created like a hashtag, go to hell with TVN, and they completely destroyed them on Twitter. They had no way to respond to that. They had to issue a public statement, saying sorry that, obviously that was a racist statement and they are very sorry that it happened. And, it only took a couple of hundred of very young people who are very fluent with social media, and they were able to, in a matter of hours, completely mock the station for their ridiculous views, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Yeah, maybe I will ask you. I don't know if it's like the last question, but more personal one, not connected to the political view and examples and so on, because but also connected to our workshop. So recently I read the interview with Polish philosopher and psychotherapist, which is like significant figure in Polish intellectual life, with Andrzej Leder. And I remember him saying that, stating that we may not recognize ourselves after a month of isolation. Mm-hmm. Because there are very difficult conditions for our society and for us as individuals. And therefore, this is a very interesting, yet it can be dangerous time for our society when it comes to the future shaping of relations, especially when when here at stake is our economical and sometimes biological survival. So I want to ask you, what do you think about is it like the isolation time is so dangerous, more dangerous, or more full of opportunities? And also, how are you coping with this state of emergency, let's say?
Yeah. Well, obviously, when you mentioned windows, I was thinking that, our contemporary situation is a window of opportunity, right? And it's a window of opportunity for all kinds of narratives. I mean, I can imagine a world in which, the global experience of global pandemic will turn the, civilization in an eco-socialist manner as well as eco-fascist manner. I mean, that we are kind of reaching a point where, we'll have to choose, right? And I think what I believe that there is always never one answer, that there is not like, the global pandemic won't change all of the world in the same way. But this is the moment where we choose which path to take. We are kind of, reaching a point of no return, that you either go this way or that way. I'm kind of hopeful when I see, for example, how quickly the global economic discourse changes. I mean, Financial Times writing an editorial on how we have to reverse neoliberalism and, bring back the welfare state because last 40 years of economic policies was simply a mistake. That's kind of hopeful, even if Financial Times says so. On the other hand, obviously, there's this whole narrative of patriotism, return of the strong nation state, which I believe is not the case because none of the nation states actually handled the pandemics even reasonably well, apart from highly technologically advanced places like Taiwan. South Korea is not. I don't think that's the very best example of how to deal with global pandemics. But I clearly agree with Andrzej Leder is a great intellectual. That's really a figure. I'm just an art historian. I agree with him that everything will change. Although as we when you look at historical examples, and me as an art historian, I tend to look at history and try to learn my lessons from history. As the protagonist of the movie and book Il Gatto Pardo says, right? Sometimes you have to change everything in order for nothing to change. So sometimes this supposedly huge change might result in actually very little impact in our everyday lives. And actually, the global economic political system known as global capitalism faced a number of crises already, and they had a big impact in the short term, and in longer terms it kind of stayed the same. I'm pretty sure that political, economic, and social center of the world is moving eastwards. We are coming back actually to China domination, domination of China, India, Indonesia. These are the, economies and countries that are really coming to power. And we'll see more of this coming to, more of power shifting to East, especially as we see how United States are failing. But still, I believe that there are very different possible outcomes, and different parts of the world will probably, some of them will follow in the lines of China and go towards, like hyper-capitalist, hyper-authoritarian, hyper-technologically advanced societies. Other places will turn kind of, in my opinion, to regressive nationalism, closing borders and pretending to be very powerful nation states. Yet, I don't think that this is really the answer for the contemporary challenges, especially if we take into consideration not only the pandemic, but also, the climate catastrophe that's happening and which global pandemic is only part of. Other places might actually turn more to leftist progressive politics and really think about bringing back, solidarizing, unionizing, bringing back welfare states, thinking about, different ways how to organize economic, political, and social life to ensure more equality, more freedom, because maybe these are the values that would actually help us to deal with the global pandemic. Still, I think that there will be different outcomes in different parts of the world, and fingers crossed that we're still part of the European Union, and that someone that although obviously, I'm totally pro-European Union, although I see all its flaws. I believe that this is a force that, is able to create something that's, something that exceeds a nation state, something that can really ensure, cooperation on a larger scale that's absolutely necessary while dealing with such a thing as global pandemic or climate catastrophe. And personally, well, I'm dealing quite well, but I'm totally in a privileged position as I work in a public institution. I have, I don't have to worry that much about money, at least for now. I mean, well, obviously I'm not very rich, but I'm at least getting my paycheck every month because I work at a public museum. But this is a very privileged situation. I also could move to the countryside to my parents because actually it is because my neighbors are using the pandemic time to redecorate their house, and the noise is unbearable there. This is really an antisocial behavior because everyone hates the guy now. And I'm coping pretty well. I use this time to learn. I read and I study a lot because during the so-called normal times, even though I work at a public art institution, I don't have as much time to learn, to read, to reflect as I would like to have, because I'm constantly organizing events, doing lectures, blah blah blah. I constantly have to face the overproduction that's part of the ethos of a public cultural institution, that you have to have a lot of events, a lot of things have to happen because you're a museum. And I hope that on my personal on the level of my personal experience, I hope that the pandemic will be also a lesson for institutions to slow down. There's a great essay entitled Towards a Slow Institution, if you're interested in how to slow down the institution that you work for and how to rethink the way institutions are organized towards overproduction. And that's completely unnecessary. That's I think a good starting point. So I cope by reading that kind of essays and hope that I would be able to implement those changes. I believe that gaining knowledge and learning your lessons also from history is also the way you go, because the more you know, the less frightened you are.
Yeah, exactly. When it comes to the hope, I recently started to read the essays of Rebecca Solnit. I remember it because of the initiative of the Greenham Common Women's Peace you mentioned, and yeah, she also writes about this example of women's strike, which hard to judge if it was a failure or success, because of they didn't actually work as preventing the military to go, but it was like a kind of symbol which spread, I think, around the world after. And yeah, and I'm also trying to be hopeful.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we could discuss. We could talk like 1 hour more, I guess, but
Sure.
I think we have to move on. Yeah, maybe last remark, because I see now that when you mentioned about Antifa symbol, the famous Antifa symbol here, you can see at my window another symbol, which I hope it will be as powerful as this one, which is like a symbol of International Women's Strike, designed by Polish graphic designer Ola Jasinowska, probably.
Yeah, Ola Jasinowska also designed the Anti-Fascist Year logo and all the stuff for the Anti-Fascist Year. Yeah, yeah, Ola is great. Yeah, but you have a very good exhibition in your window, right? There is a whole. I read that this is becoming a trend, and for example, in Germany, to hold this, balcony exhibitions, another opportunity, to exhibit art via windows, via balconies. There are so many opportunities, to rethink what art can be and how you can make use of it.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. Actually, I live on the 10th floor, so I have like a pretty big view on another window, so I can see that's like people are gluing something, changing the messages and so on. It's like very interesting to watch, especially when you have some time in the evening just to go out through your balcony and see what's changed. So actually, I think it's also like in this terms pretty interesting topic, the window. Okay, thank you very much again, Kuba, for your lecture.
Yeah, so thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you have some more questions. Probably not. I don't see anything on the chat.